Welcome, everyone, to the final panel of today. Thanks for sticking it out through a long first day of this conference on monumentality. I'm Raino Isto. I'm a postdoc here as part of the theme year of monumentality. So this panel is titled Modern and Contemporary Anti-Monumentality, Perspectives from China and Korea, and of course, it's themed anti-monumentality because at this time of the day, our feelings about monumentality, which might once have been sort of attached, have begun to turn maybe a little bit ugly. So we've turned on monumentality. But actually, so we'll see to what degree that opposition plays out and how it plays out in the two papers here. So it gives me very great pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Weihong Bao, who is an associate professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Berkeley, where her teaching and interests cover early cinema, comparative media history and theory, screen and exhibition practice, and Chinese language cinema across all periods and regions. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago, and her book is entitled Fiery Cinema, The Emergence of an Affective Medium in China, 1915 to 1945, from the University of Minnesota Press, which was a finalist for the 2016 Modernist Studies Association Best Book Prize. Her writings have appeared in a really astounding sweep of journals, including Camera Obscura, New German Critique, Representations, Opera Quarterly, and the Journal of Chinese Cinemas. And she's held a number of prestigious fellowships at institutions such as here, the Getty Research Institute, the IKKM in Germany, and currently the National Humanities Center. And she's the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Chinese Cinemas, as well as serving on the editorial boards of several other publications. She's currently working on a book tentatively entitled Background Matters, Set Design and the Art of Environment in Modern China, which examines set theory and practice in relation to the rise of environmental thinking from early to mid-20th century China, and her talk today will draw from that material. So please join me in welcoming Weihong Bao.
So thank you, Raino, for your generous introduction. I was commiserate with Dita on our way here that it was difficult to come back to Getty. It's certainly monumental to some extent. It's a larger-than-life experience. And so if there's an effect associated with monument, I think the particular aspect is how that mobilizes a memory, a living memory. So today I'm going to look at early to mid-20th century China, and I was very grateful that we have a panel preceding us to give us a very helpful context about pre-modern Chinese architecture. So on April 4th, 1938, the inland city of Chengdu in Western China hosted a unique celebration for the National Children's Day at the outset of war. Based on prominent dramatist Xiong Foxi's play For and by the Children, 儿童世界, or called The Children's World, directed by Xiong's prodigy, Yang Cunbin, that captivated the city for 3 days, involving 37,000 children, 16 elementary schools, and 60,000 spectators. Children's World was monumental in terms of its scale, function, that is to commemorate the lost land, to admonish people of the enemy threat with a call to arms, and explicit allegiance to the state. The vast-scale performance first took place in a specially constructed theater in a park before taking to the street, spreading to 7 districts of the city, occupying major street intersections and attracting exalted crowds. Designed for mass mobilization with children as both performers and audience, Yang and his team made innovations in terms of the script, theater architecture, performance, and set design to destabilize the line between performance and spectatorship, aspiring to a total theater in the age of mass mobility. Yet, if satisfying monumentality's prominent criteria of commemoration, grandiosity, and service to power, Children's World simultaneously calls to mind an anti-monument or counter-monument by its ephemerality, transience, and invitation for viewer participation. In contrast to the usual emphasis on solidity, durability, and static representation of an art or architectural object, children's world is a non-object composed of the movement of people and ephemeral sets not meant to last. Instead of the centrality of a monument in a figure-ground configuration, the round theater and street performance destabilizes such a distinction by the movement of people and sets into the audience and allow them to crisscross and surround each other. If anything, the play seeks the ground itself as the inscription of power and dissolves the distinction of figure-ground in favor of a mobile, dynamic, and total environment. In other words, the background, meant to be an invisible non-entity that serves to foreground a monument, has been turned into a prominent vehicle of monumentality itself, while evoking aesthetic strategies of an anti or counter monument. What do we make of the contradiction that bears this monumental play, which raises a problem to our usual antithesis between monument and anti-monument, their associated values between durability and transience, solidity and ephemerity, representationality and performativity, and their respective modes of power between dominance and resistance? Whereas my paper will account for the distinct practice of monumentality characteristic of propaganda art during the Sino-Japanese War, I'm interested in its ramification for monumentality, not so much as physical or formal attributes, as mechanism of power that ties politics of time-space into aesthetic means of mass organization and management. By rethinking aesthetics as techniques in terms of technologies and techniques that reshape perception and organize people and the public, I consider modern monumentality at the core concern of mass mobilization. To understand the visibility, durability, and spatial economy of monumentality, I argue, one needs to get to its underside, to historicize the role of invisibility, ephemerality, and creation of negative spaces as the ground against which monument emerges. Better still, the inverse is equally true. A significant aspect of art has to do with precisely the ephemeral and impermanent ground that serves as the monument itself. My paper will focus on this monumentality as environmentality, which is inseparable from the emergence of background as a new aesthetic and epistemological category in China, as well as a distinct theatricality identified with transnational modernist staging conceptions and practices. Rethinking set design in relation to architectural, environmental, and urban design, as well as the organization of mass mobility, the paper considers monumentality as a distinct art of the environment as a new form of power. So here's my first section. A short history of the background. The notion of monumentality as an art of the environment, I argue, has to do with the invention of background as a new aesthetic category in modern China. I refer to set design or scenic painting in its early stage as a paradoxical production of visibility and invisibility that simultaneously demands and withdraws from the viewer's attention. Painted backdrops as a commercial practice appeared in China in photography studios and on theater stages in the 1880s. The recognition of background as a new aesthetic category was made more explicit when a background painting institute was established in Shanghai in 1911. The school, which trained some of the most prominent Western-style artists in 20th century China, and shows the intimate connection between background painting and modern Chinese art. Yet the status of such paintings was problematic. Although their monumental size and realistic details demanded attention, their their spectacularity needed to be suppressed and often ran into potential conflict with human-centered drama. So I have a few examples of the backdrop painting, and this is a play produced around 1911 where you can see the background painting kind of tower over the human figure, right? And here's another one that later on the realist dramatists were mocking at. They said, they look seamless as if it's real, but if there's wind coming through, then the clock and the doorway, everything starts to shake. Right? So there is a potential conflict between them. And this is an example of actually a studio photograph that was produced in San Francisco, Chinatown. And you can see in terms of the prominence of the background drop is that, in the doorway here, there's actually the artist's name, the backdrop artist's name is there. So it really shows you the importance of the backdrop there. So this conflict between the human figure and the backdrop persisted in the 1930s when painted backdrops gave way to three-dimensional sets inspired by industrial and architectural design. Viewers often commented more on the sets than on the performers, and a number of film and theater productions were organized particularly on spectacular sets or sublime landscape. The paradoxical status of the monumental background as a construct within film and theater was transformed with the eruption of the war, with the Sino-Japanese War, when oil painters and set designers collaborated in adapting the natural environment as the set for monumental paintings, such as propaganda murals. Towards the end of my talk, I will show a little bit of what the artists did during the wartime. The rise of set design notably coincided with the emergence of environmental thinking across various disciplines in early 1910s. The standard Chinese term for environment, or 环境, changes its connotation from a neutral spatial designation, meaning the surrounding area, to a more abstract term, to the surrounding natural and social condition. And so if I can show you. So here's how the term changes its meaning in different moments of time. In the 1910s, 环境 became the Chinese term for both environment in English and milieu in French. As the new old term importing Western knowledge rerouted from Japan, 环境 quickly rose as an epistemological dominance, a pervasive way of seeing, nestled in the mesh of new disciplines such as education, biology, psychology, and sociology, as well as new spatial sciences and practices such as geography, meteorology, and environmental design, including landscape and architectural design and urban planning. This manifold discourses of environment gave rise to an understanding of environment not as a hard-edged, bound, homogeneous entity, but as a malleable ensemble subject to human reordering with tremendous social consequences. Set design, including sound design among the background fabrications, provided laboratories of environment that were used to test, critique, and supplement existing conceptions. The treatment of environment as malleable sets with transformative effects was not only crucial for producing visual and sound effects for certain monumental scenes and genres. More important, they paved the way for later art practices that turned monumentality inside out from the specific affairs of film and theater to the design and practice of the entire social landscape. So I'm coming to the second section on open monumentality. To understand set design not simply as the extension of artistic and industrial design, but social design, it is helpful to look at modern monumentality manifested in the design and practice of architectural spaces. And I'm so glad Nancy is here, who has expertise knowledge in Chinese architecture, so I'm going to be really brief in this section. Notably, Yang Cunbin calls The Children's World, the play that I started with, a new style commemoration festival ensemble play, 新式纪念节剧, evoking 纪念 as a modern concept and practice. The term 纪念, as architecture historian Lai Dening compellingly argues, emerges as a new lexical import in early 20th century China, again from the Japanese term kinen. As Lai points out, 纪念, or commemoration, became increasingly popularized in the 1910s and 20s as a modern practice of memory that took form in public gathering, museum construction, circulation of commemoration of albums, songs, badges, and stamps. And part of the modern notion of monumentality in association with this new notion of commemoration really has to do with commercial circulation and the anonymous public. While memory became commodified and integrated in everyday life and newly emerged public spaces, the nationalist government took no small part in appropriating it for consolidating a new national community by establishing a significant number of commemoration days and erecting modern forms of monuments. The new monuments, borrowing Western structures of monumentality, privileging the durability and optical grandeur in the form of obelisk, classical columns, and Gothic pavilions, but also adapting older forms of monumentality in modified archways, tombs, pagodas, and temples, as some of the examples shown in our earlier panels, re-inscribed urban and rural landscape in a new symbolic space with newly sacralized memories. Yet perhaps what characterized these modern forms of monumentality are not simply the architectural objects per se, but the coordination of various architectural constructs for a designed environment that enable particular forms of movement in assembling and shaping a mass public in a symbolic space. One of the most striking examples is the Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum built in Nanjing from 1925 to 1931. The mausoleum is an ensemble architecture occupying an enormous campus incorporating a group of buildings ascending a mountain slope for a symbolic journey. A 4-column archway served as the entrance, followed by a gate with 3 openings, a grand stairway, interspaced with 5 large platforms leading toward another open platform with 2 ornamental pillars, at the center of which seats the sacrificial hall and the separate chamber behind the hall for Sun's body. While the mausoleum marries the modern consciousness of commemoration with new physical forms of monumentality, what marks the space is its open monumentality, as Chinese historian Li Gongzhong calls it. Compared to the Mingqing Imperial Mausoleum, sharing similar architectural elements of archways, gate, pillars, and passageways with a more elaborate system of gates, steles, sculptures, walls, houses, bridges, but to organize them only to fragment space into a labyrinth of unfathomable death and mystery, where the emperor's tombs remains ultimately inaccessible. The Sun Mausoleum is characterized by its broad platforms, grand stairway, and visible architectural layout, I quote, like a seated giant opening its arms to the visitors, unquote. What is made visible, however, is not only the architectural layout of the mausoleum symbolizing Sun's egalitarian attitude and the democratic spirit of the republic, but the emergence of a modern mass public constituting the collective body and the shape of the new nation. The mausoleum is turned into a space of exhibition whose ritual function is realized by choreographing the movement of the people in a designed itinerary. Visitors go through a pilgrimage, ascending from the archway at the foothold of the mountain through the 8 flights of stairway, the tripartite gate, the open platform before gathering at the sacrificial hall to pay tribute to Sun's statue and then read his documents on the surrounding wall. Behind the wall, they eventually search the tomb chamber and walk around the circular crypt sunken into the floor where Sun's sarcophagus is rested. This highly codified space, full of Sun's teachings through inscriptions, texts, and sculptures, creates a web of meaning in a varied yet unified architectural space that inframes and surrounds the visitors. Meanwhile, the visitors are not simply surrounded, but climb up, traverse, and circumvent the architectural construct. In other words, they're not simply viewers, but actors on multiple platforms whose act of viewing, movement, and ritualized behaviors embrave them into a shared community. Such openness destabilized the figure-ground configuration. I think I have one more that gives you a different view of the complex. This openness destabilized the figure-ground configuration that marks the imported monumentality by commanding the center of attention. Instead, the figure-ground distinction keeps shifting. If the architectural features are the figures, are the visitors the ground, or vice versa? Where is the center of viewing? With the multiple and mobile vantage point, the ground keeps shifting. The ground, instead of being the seamless, homogeneous background, becomes a set of architectural constructs or plural configurations of the crowds. At the same time, the visitors become part of the architectural environment that distinguishes itself from the surrounding nature with a retaining wall that marks itself in the shape of a bell. I don't have a photo, but the whole shape is a bell shape, a symbol of national awakening in Republican China. If architecture was consumed in a mode of distraction, which Walter Benjamin would relate to cinema, this distraction here does not simply render the architecture a background, but mobilize multiple sets of interactions with the visitors to create an environmental aesthetics with heightened political meaning. Coming down to the third section. If the open monumentality of Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum makes us rethink monumentality in terms of a dynamic environment that destabilizes the figure-ground configuration, it also invites us to consider architecture design as set design, which is eventually a form of social design aiming at organizing public life. By calling the visitors actors on multiple platforms, I was hinting at a distinct theatricality that marks this architectural complex and its modes of interaction with people. To understand the specific quality and political possibility of this theatricality, I would like to move to the scene of theater itself at a particular site of theater and social experiment. I refer to Xiong Foxi, who's a dramatist that actually wrote the play that I started this essay with, who started an experimental rural theater between 1932 to 1937 as an integral part of the rural reform project invested in civic education and national citizenship stationed in Ding County, Hebei province. The Ding County theater experiment showcases a distinct theatricality, which I called environmentality, and its design and practice showed an intimate connection with the international avant-garde with a particular vision for social organization. Xiong's notion of theater as social education seeks an alternative to school education as means and training of social organization. This vision of education as social organization and reconstruction is realized through an experimental rural theater in conversation with transnational modernist theater under the rubric of what Richard Cheshner would later call environmental theater that was coined in the 1960s. Challenging the proscenium theater built on the Renaissance perspective and the demarcation between performance and spectator space, the protocol of perception that conditions the figure-ground distinction and makes stage backdrop a necessary paradox of visibility and invisibility and a counterpart of the proscenium line. Theater experiments from Russia to Germany, Ireland, and Poland were particularly keen on breaking down the actor-audience demarcation in favor of a dynamic and total environment. In Ding County, Xiong Foxi, Yang Cunbing, and Chen Zhiche shared the modernist enthusiasm in experimenting with theater architecture, staging, and acting for a particular social agenda. The dramatists work with the farmers to build 2 experimental open-air theater for a new kind of theater space contiguous with nature, rural life, and modernist aesthetic. The emphasis placed on the theater structure is to create a flexible and versatile theater that accommodates new modes of theater production and social use. And so I actually have the model of one of the theaters where you can see the picture in terms of how they're interested in this open-air theater surrounded by nature. And here are the 2 theater drawings. And this is the first theater that they built, which is pretty basic, and you see a kind of an open platform, and the emphasis really is on the stairs that can enable the movement between the stage and the audience space. And this is the second theater where they elaborated, and what they did was really to make the flat wall into the round shape and added layers of walls so that we have multiple entrance and exit. And from here, this bottom is actually the main entrance. They also added 2 additional stages so that you can have multiple interactions between the main stage, the secondary stages, and the audience. They are also interested in moving the audience around. So the audience don't necessarily have to sit here. They can actually sit on the stage. The actors can come down here. The action can also happen on the platform and the stairway, right? So it's really a very interactive and dynamic stage. And also the trees, in between these trees is a kind of secret passageway that enables the movement between different stages. So this is really in terms of the theater architecture. I should also say a little bit about the set design. What they did is they call set design itself as background. And so what they were interested in terms of background is really a kind of elemental notion of design, which is really building on a flexible design in pursuit of simplicity, suggestion, and atmosphere. And at that time, they were very interested in symbolist theater and was also part inspired by the American New Stagecraft movement. This is achieved by breaking down sets into several material elements such as the cloth, board, screen, sorghum stalk, and wood blocks. These highly malleable and versatile devices can be conjoined, assembled, folded, woven, or sewed together, painted with different colors to form a great variety of configurations. Together, they create geometrical patterns, gradations, and rhythm to enhance performance and the atmosphere of the space and background. The most flexible and elemental background, of course, is the living nature. The natural surroundings seen through the open-air theater rules out the necessity to reproduce it on stage. The sky becomes the broadest, ready-made background that can serve for both realistic and non-realistic purposes, as it, I quote, does not stand for anything, but can substitute anything. Seen in this way, the human body is not simply the figure emerging from the set, but become the raw and plastic material that corresponds with the set as a unified whole. Just like the elemental pieces of screen, board, cloth, and wood block that make up the set, the farmer actors can be sculpted into dynamic form and voices for meaningful or simply stimulating constructions. While these sets apply to a wide range of approaches to theater at Dean County to enhance performance atmosphere, for sure they eventually serve as a process to move people from art to life. I quote, in other words, it is to gradually move us from our detached existence into life and to communicate with life. In this sense, the sets are not simply fabricated background for acting, but material embodiment of life itself. Put differently, life becomes an experiment with endlessly variable possibilities by being broken down into its basic elements that transform the communication between human objects and natural environment by constantly folding and unfolding, erecting and collapsing, combining and subtracting these elements. These are just some photographs of the play that's been staged. I'm coming down to the fourth section. The Jing County Theater experiment complements the open monumentality of the Sun Yat-sen mausoleum to illustrate the plural and conflicting political promises of theatricality as environmentality, and emergent techniques of social space as set design on a grand scale, premised on a dynamic production of environment and social characters. Such an environmental techniques, as we see, does not ally with a specific political agenda, but serve for both hegemonic and democratic ends with ambiguous promise seen in each of the examples. In this sense, we can return to the wartime production of propaganda play to better understand how its plural promises unfold. In the case of the children's world, the technical and the political are inseparable. Xiong Foxi and Yang Cunbi were invested in the symbiosis between propaganda and theater experimentation, with a particular interest to reshape life through theater as innovative education. Interpreting this dual politics as particular demands and problems posed for the performance, Yang focuses on the design of the theater that can maximize the sense of movement, participation, and agitation. Yang focuses on the wheel as his structural analogy. For Yang, the theater shaped in a wheel introduces both a rotating motion and centripetal dynamic such that the circular theater, not just people, actually moves. The Chinese term for wheel, 轮盘, most frequently associated with roulette, the imported gambling device popular in the 1920s and 30s, is structurally closest to Yang's theater design with its circular rows and vertical channels at a game of movement, chance, and automaticity. Evolving from the design for the perpetual motion machine, the roulette is an inherently subversive machine, a modern form of gamble on chance against a statistic notion of probability, riding the fantasy of inexhaustible energy against the two laws of thermodynamics. Meanwhile, 轮盘's multiple connotations in Chinese, the Ferris wheel, the ship's steering wheel, vehicle wheel, and industrial wheel of the mechanized factory render the term a symbol of motion, control, and energy harnessing for productivity amid chaotic forces. In addition to the wheel's appeal to the theater's structural perpetuation of movement, the theater takes inspiration from a variety of sources for functional, symbolic, and aesthetic considerations, including the Greek theater, the Roman Colosseum, circus, sports stadium, Chinese sacrificial altars such as the Temple of the Heaven. Yang's round theater, however, is not an isolated invention drawing on an eclectic range of sources. The spheric theater, or what Arnold Arison called the surround space theaters, had attracted significant interest in other parts of the world, especially with the rise of modernist theater between the two worlds. Among this visionary theater designed from Austria, Poland, Russia, and Germany, the Haumbühne, or space theater tradition associated with Bauhaus artist Andreas Weiner's Kugel Theater. This is actually the design for that round theater, which I will return to, which really looks like a Ferris wheel, right, or the gambling roulette. The Total Theater envisioned first, so this is Weiner's Kugel Theater, which many of you are familiar with. And then the Total Theater by Walter Gropius and Friedrich Kittler's Space Stage. This is the Total Theater. This is Kistler's Space Stage, Haumbühne. And then the Endless Theater comes closest in their structure and vision. All of these designs deploy a spheric structure to create an elastic and dynamic spatial interaction between actors and audience within an all-encompassing environment of speed, motion, and rhythm as a training ground in response to the challenge of modern industrial society. Yet, if these theaters flaunt complex technological setups infused with a utopian scientific humanism that feature vertical spirals, elevator platforms, projection screens, and modern building materials of glass and wire, the children's world was much simpler in its technological construction, as I'll get back to, and in its, but no less ambitious in its social vision. Instead, it relies on design as an engineering force and the human as its primary source of energy and technology. If most of the utopian theaters cited above remained on paper due to the technical constraints and hefty costs, the round theater in Chengdu was actually built. I'll show you a few photos later on, although it's very blurry and it's hard to get like a total image, which is part of the challenge. If the avant-garde spheric theaters have been celebrated for their revolutionary energy and aesthetic experiment, the staging of the children's world exercised a complex technopolitics that in the end helps bringing out an unsavory aspect of this avant-garde theaters largely pushed aside by existing accounts. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a global conversation happening, and also I think this propaganda play invite us to revisit the avant-garde theaters kind of ambiguous political dimension. The distinct spatial design of the round theater with the circular main stage at the center, as you can see, so the main stage is actually at the center, and you can see actually the evolution from the earlier theater where I showed you, but it's actually all becoming centralized, whereas you have the secondary stage here as well as here. And then the audience space are mainly two parts, and this is where the children are sitting. They're also divided into four halves, and among them are these passageways that connect to the center, and there's staircases between the center stage and all these passageways. And the adults are sitting over here. In between are the musical bands. So this spatial design really facilitate a kind of multiple movement that allow the actors to penetrate deep into the audience space. At the same time, the children and adults actors are also summoned to act as well, mostly in terms of singing. So the passageway and rings allow the performance to expand deep into the whole theater, cutting into the spectator space while connecting different groups of the performance and spectators. Meanwhile, the audience could turn into performance by joining the chorus. As actors move along and across the circus, actors and spectators attracted and surround each other. This multi-directional movement integrated actors and audience into a total field of action encompassing all four variables previously experimented at the Dean County, when action can happen across the stage and auditorium, actors surround the audience surround the actors, and in terms of the mixed movement between the actors and audience. This dynamic movement that animates the entire theater into a rotating roulette with endless cycles of varied movement was seen as the product and symptom of total mobilization and the total war of resistance. The connection between total war in terms of its multi-directionality involvement and total mobilization in terms of the mobile environmentality and endlessly varied, encompassing movement that leaves no corner unturned, indeed recalls the avant-garde spheric theater from Italian futurism in terms of Pompili's synthetic theater, the Bauhaus, and the Soviet constructivism. Yet if the avant-garde experiments aimed at breaking down social hierarchy by exercising varied movement, unpredictable interaction, and fluid boundary between acting and spectatorship, the staging of the children's world as an exemplary design for mass mobilization reintroduces the hierarchy through environmental control to harness the energy of spontaneity to a design perpetuation of the system. Report commands the order, rigidity, and military manner of the stage in coordinating individual and collective body to form uniform lines, shapes, and movement. The whole show came close to a pageant play that mixed dramatic performance, singing, and parade, but also incorporated modern rituals and sports and political convention. And so I should probably show you a few images of the. So this is actually, not going to talk about it, but after performing on the round-shaped theater, they actually eventually go onto the street, and you can see how highly disciplined that performance is. The whole city was divided into 7 different districts, and in each district, they use a traffic corner to summon the audience and perform, and then there are Boy Scouts riding bicycles from one station to another to coordinate the performance. So it's a highly orchestrated performance. And here are just some of the images, which are very blurred, unfortunately. And so this is really where the entrance is. And then this where the center stage, they're doing a flag raising ceremony, and where the audience is located. This is actually a slogan of Children's Factory, which takes place in one of the action. And many of the scenes feature children making toy weapons, basically. And that's really the scene of the parade when it takes to the street. So the spheric theater thus becomes a spectacle of hyper-organization and division of industrial and military labor. Out of the 5 acts of the film, Act 2 was devoted to task assignment itself. The mass mobilization then is in the end mobilized by people themselves, although their mobility needed to be drawn out through a design of controlled environment and environmental design that initiates and guides the movement to capture the maximum form of energy. The technological setup became the frame that treats the human, in a Heideggerian sense of technology, as the standing reserve. Yet the human are not simply the passive, inert nature, but part of the machinery that is turned vital. The rotating theater of masses, as the product and sign of total mobilization and total war, is thus the production of a mobile environment that takes people into this environment as both a machinery and source of energy. Like a rotating wheel, so I think I'm gonna skip this, I'm coming to the end. How am I doing with time? Okay, great, perfect. So such a mobile theater entails not only new conceptions of script theater space and performance, but a radicalized notion of set design as well. Instead of treating set as immobile background, Jung actually favors environmental design over set design by reconceiving theater as a space for movement, enabling a mobile mise-en-scène. This mobile theater realizes what Jung calls the trinity of art, education, and politics by simply transforming them, pushing them to broader conceptions that integrate education and politics into the masses' everyday life. As a result, such unification transformed politics into, I quote, the education of mass organization. In turn, this education becomes the masses' life, and such art becomes the weapon of survival for the masses. For Jung, politics no longer belonged to an elite minority that could be transformed side by side with art and education, and here's the twist. Jung, like the other propagandists, mobilized audience into ages of mass action. His mobile theater follows a linear mode of transmission through the spatial itinerary of controlled movement, yet instead of conceiving spectators as targets at the receiving end of the play, the mass actors and spectators are no longer separable, nor are set and performance background and action. Jung's play suggests not only the double bind of control and freedom extended to the broadest level of social life, the symbiosis of radical theater and social management, but also its possible reversal, turning theater from a tool of social management into a weapon of survival for the masses. So just have a concluding few sentences. I started out by posing the propaganda play as simultaneously a monument and anti-monument to question dominant assumptions of monumentality and its antithesis evolving around criteria of durability, grandiosity, and affiliation with power. Whereas anti-monument does not challenge these assumptions by playing its opposite, the crux of the issue is not the ideological positioning of certain aesthetic practice, but how changing modes of monumentality provide us opportunities to examine different modes of power. What I call environmentality as a distinct monumentality connected to Chinese artistic practice broadly construed translates matters of aesthetics into technopolitics as shaping forces of perception and political communities. It is simultaneously a radical reorganization of human and its environment, be natural or social, and a modern form of governmentality. If we recognize the effective power as essential of monument, as Francois Choi points out, it is not simply a question of informing, of calling to mind a neutral bit of information, but rather of stirring up through the emotions a living memory. Monumentality is not simply the mobilization of such memories as a living present, but the assembly of people that sustains and makes sense of such memories. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It gives me very great pleasure now to introduce the last speaker of today, Jung-Ah Wu. Jung-Ah is currently Associate Professor of Art History at POSTECH, the Weihong University of Science and Technology in South Korea, where she teaches on modern and contemporary art. She received her PhD from UCLA here in Los Angeles, and her research area is the post-war art of East Asia and the United States, with particular interest in collective memory, historical trauma, and identity politics. Jung-Ah is the author of Art of the Bereaved in Korean, published in 2015. A study of contemporary artists across the globe who come to terms with traumatic memories of political atrocities and personal tragedies through alternative artistic means. Most recently, Jung-Ah's study of a community-based artistic project after the Great East Japan earthquake and the problematic discourse of national solidarity appeared in print in April of this year in the Archives of Asian Art. Jung-Ah is currently a scholar here at the Getty Research Institute, where her investigations focus on Korean art of the 1990s against the backdrop of globalization and rapid socio-political changes in Korean society, and she'll be presenting some of that material to us today. So please join me in welcoming Jung-Ah.
Thank you, Raino. It is a great pleasure for me to be here. And I know you guys are waiting for me very much because I'm the last speaker. And for your information, I'm going to use the Korean name in Korean way, family name first, given name last, because I'm going to talk about nationalism today. In Korean cultural history, the 1960s and 1970s are remembered as the age of monuments. After rising to power by military coup in 1961, the President Park Chung-hee urgently needed to affirm his regime's legitimacy and stabilize the disrupted society. To these ends, Park administration actively utilized the cultural policies as a way to instigate loyalty and a sense of national belonging among the people. Park initiated long-term programs that promoted Confucian values of filial piety, sponsored ethnographic studies, developed cultural heritages, and constructed the cult of national heroes and patriots, all under the grand banner of national revival. In tandem with these expanded cultural policies, Park administration emphasized and exaggerated various internal and external threats to Korea, such as the Japanese colonial legacy, communism from the North, and the decadent culture from America, in order to cultivate cultural exclusionism and excessive nationalism. The overall goal was to create a superior type of Korean who would respect traditional ethics, conform to the social order, and ultimately sacrifice personal interest for the sake of the country. Eventually, Park's authoritarian regime was justified by almost frenzied economic growth. The GNP per capita, for example, rose from $80 in 1960 to $6,749 in 1992. Within one generation, an impoverished, war-torn agricultural society metamorphosed into a highly advanced industrial nation. If traditional monuments are heroic and self-aggrandizing figurative icons that glorify communal solidarity and create a mythological version of the nation-state, then representative example can be the Park administration's monumental project, erecting memorial statues of patriotic martyrs. The initiative officially inaugurated in 1968, and for the first 4 years, 15 pieces of public statues of national heroes were erected across the country. Among the numerous monuments, the bronze statue of Admiral Lee Sun-shin in the heart of Seoul has become the icon of Korea, if not from the moment of its unveiling in 1968. So we have another admiral here. So Admiral Lee was a 16th century naval commander of Joseon Dynasty. Well, this is the movie poster of 2014. And then this is the record hit of Korean movie history, because this admission was 17 million people, and this is #1 blockbuster hit in Korean film history, and now that record is threatened by Avengers these days. His military achievement is truly legendary. Despite having only about a dozen ships left at his command, he successfully and ingeniously fought off the Japanese fleet of 330 ships. He achieved multiple victories, ostensibly saving the nation from a devastating invasion, and was killed at the final battlefield. Lee thus came to embody both the moral virtue of self-annihilation and the historical trauma of war and invasion. It is notable that this particular statue was constructed solely by the personal fund of Park Jung-hee. So you said clearly Park Jung-hee's dedication. As a former major general, Park attempted to identify his coup d'etat with Admiral Lee's historic feat that defended the nation and rescued his people from impending doom. It was not an accident that 5 or 1/3 of the 15 statues commemorated the military commanders from the ancient past to Joseon Dynasty, and 13 are men, of course. So in other words, the official discourse of national revival under Park's military authoritarianism was highly gendered. The monumental growth of Korean economy is a hybrid byproduct of dictatorship combined with Confucian parental governance. Critical commentators would refer this as to hyper-masculinized developmentalism. It's a byproduct of developmental nationalism and hegemonic masculinity. In 2001, at the 49th Venice Biennale, Seo Do-ho essentially pulled a statue down from its pedestal. Given the prestigious honor of representing the Korean National Pavilion, Seo introduced public figures, which consist of a classical pedestal where a magnificent bronze monument of a national hero would be expected to stand. Seo's pedestal, however, is left empty. After some time, viewers eventually realized that instead of a single hero gazing down at them from on high, there are countless tiny figurines looking up at them from below. Lined up in precise formation, these public figures are raising their arms with all their might to support the crushing weight of the granite pedestal, which is actually made of fiberglass and resin. We are left to wonder whether the figures are aware of the emptiness of their monument, or they are holding up the burden blindly. The artist called the work an anti-monument that functions as a nuanced challenge to the conventional concept of the distant and elevated public figure. Seo's anti-monument effectively embodies the idea of imagined community famously defined by Benedict Anderson. Anderson emphasized that fraternity is the driving force to sustain the collective imagination. I quote, "Finally, the nation is imagined as a community because, regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that they may prevail in each, the nation is conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people not so much to kill as willing to die for such limited imagining." I believe what inspires those anonymous individuals to hold up the meaningless monument of the empty pedestal is not the mighty hero that they imagine to be up there, but rather the fraternity that originates from their perception that they are all equally sharing the pain of maintaining something, or better said, nothing. In December 2016, President Park Geun-hye, I cannot stop smiling. President Park Geun-hye was impeached by the National Assembly and then removed from office by ruling of the Constitutional Court on March 2017. It is the achievement of the candlelight demonstration in which over 17 million Korean citizens in all gathered together nationwide, holding candlelight as a way to denouncing the Park administration's corruption scandal and calling for the resignation of President Park. So 17 million is actually 1/3 of the entire South Korean population. And then that is a magic number because the movie of Lee Sun-shin got the 17 million admission. So it is a sheer irony that the largest rallies took place in Seoul's Gwanghwamun Square, right under Admiral I's statue, which was built by the former president Park Chung-hee, or Park Geun-hye's father. Despite the lack of organized leadership, the thousands and thousands of citizens innovated political demonstration by maintaining peace, order, and festivity during their citial marches for several months. So I believe these people kind of reactivated this conspicuously inconspicuous public monument. So the spectacular scenes of candlelight revolution, as it is now called, against the backdrop of the high pedestal of Admiral I's monument seem to augment Seo Do-ho's public figures into the actual reality of an overwhelming scale, where the anonymous individuals were united for the sake of fraternity and patriotism in order to rescue their nation under peril. Certainly, the anti-monument does not celebrate the comfort of belonging, but it is also more than a simple critique of the individual's submission to a suppressive whole. In this presentation, I'm going to examine the works of 2 Korean contemporary artists, Seo Do-ho and Oh In-hwan, in terms of anti-monument. Born around the 1960s, educated under Park Chung-hee's military dictatorship, benefited from the rapid economic growth. I witnessed the violent struggles for democratization in the 1980s and moved out of the country in the wake of globalization of the 1990s. These artists certainly share common generational experiences in relation to their home country. I will argue that the artists created anti-monuments as an alternative notion for the problematic monuments of nation-building agenda. Being mobile, ephemeral, dispersed over time, lightweight, and translucent, the anti-monuments challenge the established views of the national history and its highly gendered ideology, provoke communication among the viewers regarding the burden of collectivity, community, and solidarity. Subverting the typical grammar of monuments, these artists delve into the dialectics at work in the social, historical, and psychological processes of forming the identities of both the individual and the nation in idiosyncratic ways. I believe that their individual processes of registration and representation of national identity offer a deeper understanding of the troubled nature of nationalism and patriotism that have prevailed in the cultural discourse of Korea and beyond. Sadoho's early works reveal his primary concern with the dialectic of individuality and collectivity in identity formation. His installation, Who Am We, consists of a unique wallpaper which envelopes the walls and columns of the exhibition space. Guess who she is? It's my daughter. Saw reduced the size of over 30,000 portrait photographs scanned from high school yearbooks and then printed them onto sheets of paper. A closer scrutiny of each and every face revealed the distinctive facial features of the individuals who can barely be distinguished because of their almost identical hairstyles and uniforms, which were and still are enforced in most Korean schools. But from a distance, the endless portraits are dissolved into the all-over color tone of the wallpaper as printing pixels. The title of the piece, with its grammatical twist, Who Am We, and the perceptual experience relate the interdependence of the individual identities and their collective whole. For high school uniform, Seo hung 300 uniform jackets on steel coat hangers in a stiff vertical posture and then connected them by their shoulder seams to create a massive singular body of work. The black outfits, originally derived from military uniform designs, are arranged in a strict grid like a marching squad. Seo has created a number of uniform installations, and each of them is associated with his own transitory membership in a series of social groups, moving from kindergarten to high school to college and to army as a mandatory step for all Korean males. The irritatingly oppressive nature of a collective unity generates a concurrent awareness of Korea's uncomfortable political condition. Since South Korea is still locked in a Cold War with North Korea, military service of a certain duration remains compulsory for Korean males, and the artist was not exempt from the military obligation. In Someone, Seo used thousands of military dog tags to construct an enormous armor jacket, which, interestingly, resembling that of Admiral E. The overwhelming mountain of shimmering tags soared from the floor toward the ceiling, but hollowed inside, provoking an awful foreboding of death imposed for the sake of the homeland. The military connotation of Someone continues to resonate in Paratrooper number 5. Standing firmly on a podium, a paratrooper is struggling with thousands of fine strings, each of which is connected to embroidered signatures on a parachute. So the names denoted by the signatures are technically connected with the artist, as he collected them from his close friends and relatives. Through their various relationships with their own friends and acquaintances, the number of signatures increased into the thousands. The artist explains that a parachute is often crucial for a soldier to enter enemy territory, but once landed, it may easily become an adversary by tangling the paratrooper. So the entire body of Seo's works is thus inspired by the artist's private memories and experiences, but his personal narratives are charged with this tension which presides over the delicate relationship between individual and collective, private and public, belonging and detachment. Since 2001, Oh In-hwan has installed Where He Meets Him at different venues. Using powdered wooden incense, Oh writes directly on the gallery's floor the names of gay bars and clubs of the city and put them on fire at the opening of the show. Operation of the work, which burns throughout the duration of the exhibition, therefore, is not only visual, but also physical, in a sense that it penetrates the viewer's body in forms of odor molecules, on one hand, and leave indelible marks of letters like scars on the floor on the other hand. However, the words of the work convey meaning only to those who are familiar with the gay community of the neighborhood, and for others, they became virtually meaningless array of random words. Indeed, the border of one's body is porous, and language as a symbolic system is by no means flawless and universal, but rather incomplete and fragile. Regarding this work, art critic Jung-Ah referred to unspeakable love, especially because in Korea, homosexuality has long been taboo and even regarded as detrimental to the societal order under the conservative Confucian conventions and the persistent intolerance of Korean conservative Christians, and there are many. Well, in other words, the artist engraved the unspeakable letters otherwise prohibited from being written for the sake of patriarchal society on the skin of the authoritative institution of the museums in the extremely physical and destructive manner. The moment of their clear enunciation is paradoxically the moment when the letters are burned into ashes. In video, The Flag and I, O further complicated this relationship of body, violence, and symbolic order. He searched for the biggest taegukgi, the South Korean national flag in Korea. While maintaining the official pose for saluting the flag, the artist kept holding the camera in order to videotape the flag on the pole in 3 separate parts from bottom to top. The saluting to flag was put in force along with the Pledge of Allegiance under a presidential decree in 1972, which requires the Korean citizens to salute and recite the pledge at public gatherings, in every evening of the weekday in public spaces, and at the start of each week of classes from elementary through high school. So basically, when I was a kid, I had to stop doing everything at 6 o'clock, wherever you are and whatever you are doing. We have to just stop and do the salute. So the original version of the pledge literally translates, I am firmly committed to fulfilling my allegiance by offering my body and soul for the endless glory of my fatherland and race before the proud taegukgi. Accused of being oppressive, jingoist, and too militant, the pledge was revised in 2007. In the revision, Republic of Korea takes place of my fatherland and race. Liberty and justice were newly added as the priority values, while offering my body and soul was deleted. However, Oh's video performatively proves that the flag still requires the dedication of body, if not soul. As time passes, the filmmaker trembles, moans, and sighs because of the physical pain of holding the camera and maintaining the body erect. The seamless alignment of the flagpoles as a phallic symbol of the nation-state across the 3 vertical screens in the first part of the video are gradually shaken, disturbed, fragmented, and eventually fallen apart against the background sound of growing and gasping from the artist, which simultaneously erotic and pathetic, sorrowful and hilarious. So if Republic of Korea calls for the dedication of the body of its citizens, this body of artists may not be qualified enough, given Korean society's adamant homophobia and hegemony of masculinity. Certainly, Oh may not be a proper real man by Korean standard. A military song of Korean army, Real Man is a popular and well-known among men and women of all ages. Along with a cheerful and exciting march, the lyric goes, once you're born as a man in this world, there are a lot of things to do, but you and I are living for the honor of defending our nation. So in his video, The Real Man, which is a LACMA collection right now, Oh repeated, inverted, fragmented, and rearranged the musical score and lyrics in order to transform the song into an electro trance music. In the video, song starts with slow, gentle, and almost melancholic tone, but is mixed with the electro dance music, while each letter of the lyric is rearranged by the order of Hangul, the Korean alphabet, and flickering on wide LED projection. So I'm going to show you the video of Real Man. But in order to give you the sense of this original song, I meant to play a video, but then I realized that I actually know the song. Curiously. So yeah, I'm going to sing it. If you don't mind, all right? I've never done this before, so okay, I will do it. All right. Let's do it. 사나이로 태어나서 할 일도 많다만 너와 나 나라 지키는 영광에 살았다. You know, this is the song. All right. I know you wanted to listen to this forever. So gradually, the solemn determination of sacrifice and the grim resolution of defending the nation dissolves into a jaunty tune of recreational scene of a dance club. The psychedelic lighting and the percussive beats of the trance music fuel this feeling of mass communion and the inhibition-reducing effects. Regardless of being real or not, everybody is invited to join this conviviality. In 2012, 서도호 presented a solo show, Home Within Home, at Lium Samsung Museum of Art in Seoul. Since 1999, when the artist first introduced his whole home, LA home, at the Korean Cultural Center in Los Angeles, Seo has made the exact copies of his homes that he went through in major urban centers such as Seoul, New York, and Berlin, along with their entire structures and the ornamental details using translucent fabric and needlework. If uniforms are considered as the site of identity, Seo vastly expanded this notion to incorporate the spatial experience of one's dwelling, formulating a house as a larger, more complex set of clothes that intervenes a person's relationship with the environment. It is notable that his whole home, which was modeled on the home in Seoul where Seo was raised, is a traditional Korean wooden house with tiled roofs and papered windows, a type of home that is by no means typical in contemporary Korea. A fragile architecture of the delicate fabric dangled from the high ceiling of the museum, and visitors were welcome to pass through the homes and fully examine the phantom houses of artists of different styles, from Korean traditional house to a flat in Berlin. This physical experience of transition generates myriad associations with migration, dislocation, and nostalgia. Seo later recollected that the experience of unveiling this intimate rendering of his own home to an anonymous crowd, thereby allowing them to project their own memories and fantasies onto his private space, was not entirely pleasant. His personal home dissolved into a universal site of nostalgia, even though most visitors had never experienced this type of residence. Everyone who visits Home Within Home, regardless of nationality and race, is surely reminded of the comfort and safety of their own home. So rather than the sole creator of Home Within Home, Seo chose to become just another visitor who gazes up at the work and thinks of his own version of home. Living as a foreigner in unhomely homes in strange places, he only felt at home when surrounded by fellow migrants who shared his yearning for home. Seo therefore no longer belongs to any home, having left to join the crowds of people fated with instability and alienation, who wander from one city to another like drifting fragments, always dreaming of returning home. Within this fragmentary and fundamentally temporary relationship with others, his traumatic nostalgia seems to be worked through. In 2015, O presented Looking Out for Blind Spots at MMCA, the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Seoul. So inside the gallery, the CCTV cameras were looking down on the viewers from the high ceiling, and the artist hung 2 monitors at the entrance in order to show the viewers inside the spotless gallery. In short, the viewers are the viewers of the viewers who actually are being viewed. However, when viewers walk into the actual gallery, they encounter a completely different view from the one on the monitor. The walls that remain out of the camera's angles are entirely covered with pink box tape. The blind spots, namely the surplus space not caught by the camera, an area that resists the gaze of surveillance, or the residue that avoids the dominant system of representation, are much wider and variety than we expected. So this artist will have a solo show at 2 venues in LA this fall, one in Commonwealth and Council in Koreatown and Pack Art in La Cienega. It's an advertisement. So the artist called the pink tape an embodiment of the other that has constantly fought for its presence despite being excluded from the hegemonic ideology, that has existed without being written as a symbol and has been in language without having any property of language. In between the pink tapes, there are My Blind Spot guidelines are inscribed. The artist interviewed the discharged soldiers to share their experiences to find out blind spots in barrack life to fulfill their private desire. The guidelines present genuine life wisdoms, such as keep all possibilities open because there are more blind spots that are ineffectively managed than you would expect. Be innovative to find a place that no one would imagine to be left empty and safe. And last but not the least, and my favorite, is very simple, be brave. So these artists urge us to be brave, to become outsiders, or better, outliers. Thank you very much.
So as before, I'd like to begin by asking the two of you if you have sort of questions that came up either for each other or questions that you'd like to pose collectively to all of us or to yourself and your fellow presenter.
I actually have a question for Jung-Ah.
Okay.
I think that the modular question really comes back in the earlier session and to think about its modern modes of production. But I have a question about creative industry and creative labor here. And it seems that many of the earlier examples that you gave are using a rather fixed form, and it's about multiplication. It's duplicating so many, it's using the standard form, right, as the photograph that looks like a comb, like a beehive. So and also the costumes. Okay. So it's duplicating in a kind of standard form that seems to be referencing modern mass reproducibility as well. So I wonder, who are the people actually doing the work?
The labor, you mean the artist labor. So both of them basically, they're really like a contemporary artist model. They just, have this concept, and then the actual, physical production were done by the artist assistants. And then actually I talked this, and then Seodoho's case, there are, the production scene of especially the house copies is really kind of sublime because all the very middle-aged Korean ladies, the seams ladies, they just got together and doing all this sewing work. And then, Seodoho also participated in the production, but these two artists believe that this physical kind of production of the work and this conceptual, like a conceptualization of our work can be like a separate process. So yeah, the production and is like, separate part from their conception.
I have a sort of a quick follow-up question to that, and it has to do with the term anti-monumentality and the context of contemporary art. And you began, and actually Weihong also cited the idea of the anti-monument as something that is ephemeral, it's something that's portable, it's something that's possibly translucent, it's, we've touched on already today the material aspects that are often associated with traditional monumentality. But I'm always a little bit curious when this term is brought up in contemporary art because so much of the kind of art that is produced for Biennale culture would already fulfill many of those material requirements. And even in the cases when fairly permanent things, I'm thinking of I've forgotten the name of the work itself, but for Documenta 14, the creation of the kind of monument to refugees, which was actually conceived as a quite permanent thing, has already been asked for it to be removed. So I'm curious, is there any work of Biennale aimed contemporary art that is not anti-monumental?
Yes, right. So like I talked about this, Oh In-hwan, the artist, and then for him, this format is very important because he himself is like, gay coming out as a gay artist in Korean society. So he believes his kind of like a personal status itself is very unstable. So he believes that his artistic forms should be unstable, like incense or the powder, and it should be mobile. And actually, he's very cautious about choosing the location of his exhibition. He tried to kind of evade very authoritative and prestigious space, except for that MMCA thing. And then, so that is one thing. And then in case of Seodoho, I was really hesitant about showing other works because in format-wise, they're really monumental. Look at the 300 uniforms like seam together and create very overwhelming body of artworks. And then so like I also asked myself, how can I call this anti-monument? And I try to persuade myself because, his idea itself is against this kind of collectivity or state-sponsored national kind of things. And then he tried to emphasize this individuality and how this individuality can kind of, not just a simple critique of this suppression of the whole, but also it can be like a positive power to be like influenced, to have some influence in the society. So that's how I kind of persuade myself.
I think we can open it up to questions if people have somewhere out over there.
Thank you both. Those are really rich talks. I especially appreciated the diversity of examples you showed in them. My question is, in a way, the opposite of the one that was just asked. Is there such a thing as an anti-monument? I'm coming from a non-contemporary perspective, so I was wondering in examples in both of your cases, if they're anti-monuments or if they're art about or against particular kinds of monuments, or, are these really monuments that are created, that are in particular contentious conversation with certain kinds of monuments? And I'm thinking also of an example I saw just this week in the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard just opened a monument, something called a monument to impermanence, that makes me think of the issues of ephemerality and mobility that you both raised. And it's a pile of dirt that essentially gets worn down over time by weather, and then people can rake it back up. But at a certain point, it's going to just same concept. But again, can you have a monument to impermanence? Is there really such a thing as an anti-monument, and what do you both think that means?
So thank you. Actually, my paper is really critiquing the concept of anti-monument. As I mentioned at the beginning and the end, the notion of anti-monument doesn't really challenge the assumptions behind monumentality. Right, so by just being its antithesis. And in a way, it's a kind of a perversion of that notion when I try to look at, because I think we tend to associate anti-monument and its associated values in terms of ephemerality, transience, all those things with intrinsically subversive and positive value. And the instance that I said is actually a propaganda play. Right, so it's an intentional perversion of that. Yeah.
Well, we have the scholar lecture, and Alexa introduced it briefly at her introduction. And our first talk was Renee Ater, and she talked about this, the public memorial for the slave ancestry. So like this anti-monument or like counter-monument emerged as a term to designate certain like artistic or public practices that try to commemorate without celebrating it. Right, so like, for example, like most representative example can be the Holocaust memorials, right? So this counter monument is kind of like applied to that examples of, the Holocaust. So in order to, how to kind of represent this traumatic memory that is essentially unrepresentable, right? And how to remember those, traumatized past without celebrating it, without glorifying it. So this counter monument or anti-monument is a kind of like Not exactly a genre, but it's a problematic for the contemporary artist who to try to kind of commemorate those bad memories, I think. So the format can be, very just like negative or ephemeral or self-degrading or intentionally undistinguished. So yeah, that's.
I think there's one up in the back, unless there was someone before that. Oh, okay.
That's okay.
You've got the mic, so you go ahead
okay.
first while the mic makes its way up
I
there.
thought there were two mics. Okay. Thank you so much. So when you talked, Weihong Bao, when you talked about the background, I immediately thought of Sergei Eisenstein, who famously said in the late 30s that the background becomes the foreground, and that the mass becomes the hero. So this is a turnaround also when it comes to the, to the traditional idea that the background basically serves as a stage for the one and only who makes the difference, as it were. And he explicitly talked, it's intriguing what he does, aesthetically speaking, when he talks about this background becoming an actor. And so he also experiments with that, obviously, and he has a big fight with the Soviet officials about Alexander Nevsky, where the officials want the hero to be strong, and he wants the masses to be strong, and so on and so forth. So I think that this is just basically probably a case where similar cases come up, because it's also about the homogeneity or rather heterogeneity of this background. So what you said about the kind of rigidity in your late examples of this mass organization and so on, that is very much in play when it comes to more or less conformist Soviet art. So this probably is more of a comment, but I think we can discuss probably the differences and commonalities between these two traditions, which eventually possibly are just one tradition going back to earlier experiments. The question I have, but I mean, I think this is where your two talks connect, because the public figures could be read as a background becoming a foreground. I love that piece. I didn't know it, to be honest. I love it. So this, I think, is the very same idea. But my question, very briefly, is about your talk of environment and background. And I mean, maybe this is just déformation professionnelle, but from a conceptual point of view, I think there's a difference between the two. Also, when it comes to the conceptual history. So you mentioned milieu, which obviously is the term. And I'm not an expert on the history of milieu, but one key, crucial point is French sociology of the 19th century, where this milieu comes up. And it's very much about the embeddedness of the individual being kind of driven by social forces. And so it's very much about embeddedness. And the same goes for environment. And the same goes for the German translation of milieu, which is Umwelt. So it's all about embeddedness. It's all about kind of belonging to something. And it's also about a certain disempowerment, as it were, of the person in the middle. Not necessarily in a bad way, it's just contextualizing. It's very much about contextualization. Now, the background is something that serves as a background for the actor who enters the scene. And then, and that's a different game. You can still have a battle then, the battle that I mentioned earlier when it comes to Eisenstein and the background and the leading role, as it were, but it's an agonistic relation. So you have the background, and the background can take over, as you mentioned in your early examples. It happens that the background becomes so powerful, but then it's kind of directed against the figures.
No. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
So thank you. I really appreciate your question, despite the complaint. And this is really the heart of the issue. So I'm so glad you're raising this question. And so originally, when I was looking, my whole book is about, it's called Background Matters, and then it's really about the question of the environment. And so can we conflict them, and whether they have different intellectual genealogies is really crucial. And originally, when I use background, it's basically a metaphor, right? The key issue for me really is environment, and I look at intellectual history across biology, sociology, and psychology, mostly in early 20th century, in conversation with European discourses. And so, but when I was looking at background, I realized actually it's quite complex. It's never just about a pictorial background or aesthetic background in terms of the studio backdrop of photography or film and theater. Actually, when I look at, I think this is in the English uses as well. I'm not sure about other languages, but in the Chinese language, when you use the term beijing or background, it could refer to a physical backdrop or physical thing that is suppressed to foreground something, right? This is the basic figure ground configuration that we're talking about. It could also refer to one's history. So this person's background, right? Do a background check, right? Or the backstory of something, which is really the context of something. It's also, it can also refer to one's unconsciousness. This is in the background of my thoughts, right? So it could be psychological, it could be physical, it could be technical. And so that's why I think actually it's very interesting to put them together, not just to totally conflate it, but really in my different chapters, they play different roles. But the environment is a bigger question. As you mentioned, there actually, I don't think we can entirely equate the French notion of milieu with the German notion of Umwelt. There's also the notion of Stimmung, right, and atmosphere, so and ambience. So it's a rather complex history. But the French term milieu, of course, comes from really biology, right? And so there's a very strong sense of evolutionary biology, thinking about really the force of the environment. So there's a long debate between heredity versus environment that was very much revived in the Chinese intellectual discourses in the early 20th century. And the German notion Umwelt by the biosemiotician Oxko is very interesting because for him, it's not so much about being embedded environment, but really the environment gets individuated through modes of perception. For example, a dog's Umwelt of the world is very different from the bee's Umwelt of the world. And later on becomes problematic because it also becomes an argument of the Lebensraum, which is an argument of fascism, right? So geopolitics also play a role. So environment is a really important issue for me. And the way I called environmental thinking is not at all environmentalism that was circulating in the 1960s in America. Instead, it's really thinking about the emergence of environment as a mode of, as an object as an object of knowledge and social action, right? So the whole book is really organized around the historical co-emergence between set design as an aesthetic practice across film, theater, and photography and architecture, and the intellectual genealogies of environment in different social moments. So it's a rather complex concept, and I'm so glad and grateful that you're pointing things out, and there are a lot of complexity in those two notions that really shouldn't be conflated. So thank you for that.
Okay, up in the back.
I really love what Weihong Bao said about suggesting the kind of insidious potentials of the anti-monument, and kind of riffing off what other people have said. I was wondering whether that could be put into contact with what Jung-Ah the material that you've talked about. I guess on the one hand, as you've presented it, many of these artists and artworks are questioning kind of the integrity of the nation state and traditional, patriotic, hyper-masculine values and so forth. And it's coming out of this particular experiences as a gay man, for instance, in one case, etc. But I'm wondering whether maybe at a broader scale, some of these artworks are perhaps unconsciously also registering and reinforcing something of our own historical moment, a kind of neoliberal paradigm, for instance, that has also kind of questioned the integrity of the nation state, and that's problematic potentially in its own way. And even questions of ephemerality take on a different color if we think about the way that we live in a world where everything is kind of disposable, from like plastic spoons and forks and so forth, so the questioning of the substantiality of things perhaps has an insidious dimension that is sort of reflected by these Korean artists who are now in a nation that is participating in a kind of global economy.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And, I was, preparing this talk, and Seodoho was kind of, as you saw, just like a key example of my Korean anti-monument movement. And then Renee at Ater, actually, she wrote about Seodoho's kind of similar format of work that was installed in this, like African-American community, park. So like somehow this is Seodoho's work, somehow cannot be, really bounded by this, Korean nationality, but it can be interpreted in many different ways. And then, but I wanted to emphasize that the reason I began with this Park Chung-hee administration and its military dictatorship and how Korean society is very drive toward this, masculinity and developmentalism. It's very kind of, I believe it's really specific condition that brought about these type of anti-monumental sensibility, not only Seodoho but also Oh In-hwan. But I know this is kind of my bigger project, but a lot of Korean artists who came out of that generation has this kind of very complicated relationship with their nation. They're really patriotic, but at the same time they're very critical. And then we have this moment of a candlelight revolution. So I just can explain that I want to focus on to be really concrete situation of Korean history, and then I try to see these artworks in this very politically, timing specific way. Yeah.
I just have two comments. One, I'm playing around with this concept of propaganda as anti-monumentality. I think in certain societies, propaganda is monumentality. I think in socialist society, I think we could make a case that Tiananmen Square was redesigned as propaganda. And I think maybe the case could be made for Sun Yat-sen's mausoleum. Also, it's a certain kind of nationalist propaganda. I think you could make that case. And the other thing, I just have kind of a general question. So, this issue of monuments to impermanence is really fascinating to me because we've seen several tombs, which I wonder if we should interpret them as monuments to impermanence, or are they monuments that try to defy impermanence? I mean, it of course has to do with the concept of death, but corporeal remains are impermanent. So I just want to throw those two thoughts out.
Can I respond? Thank you so much for those two great questions. So the first question of whether propaganda should be anti-monumental or monumental, I'm actually saying well, I'm definitely not saying it's just anti-monument, because I'm really questioning both concepts to see exactly what, I think this is the point of the whole symposium. We're really trying to figure out what monumentality is, right? So the problem of the notion of anti-monument is that if you raise this notion, you have to define monument in a certain way. Right.
The Korean propaganda also
Yeah.
could be described as monumental when you take 17 million people.
In terms of the scale, yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's why the talk is in the symposium, yeah. So thank you so much for that. And also, so I think we're really different ways of talking about monumentality. We have talked about in terms of scale, in terms of its relationship with time, in relation to memory, its effective power in terms of its social effects. So the really multiple way, and the way I talk about it in terms of environmentality, both as a mode of social engagement and social governance. So the other question that you talk about in terms of tomb, that is very much in my mind, yeah. And so I was thinking, again, I think I was recently reading François Choy's book about the invention of the monument, where she makes a distinction, of course, between monument and historical monument. Monument is really the Rico's definition in terms of an intentional monument. Historical monument is a retroactive one, because it's really has to do with politics of historicism and also preservation, right? So those monuments accidentally or from the historical hindsight become monument. They were not intentionally there. But the other question that she raises, which is very interesting, is really, I think, as a film scholar, I cannot help in thinking about Bazin, is talking about photography and film as a mommy complex. Right, so in terms of, so we're thinking about how art object becomes a way of defense against impermanence, precisely. And she actually talks about how the monument declined precisely because of competing mnemonic technologies such as photography and film. Right.
Other questions? Carl?
Thank you. I'm fascinated by the works of art by Korean artists and by your interpretation. And I feel very unsure. And I would like to ask a question. One of the most convincing solutions for creating an anti-heroic monument, in my view, or create an anti-monumentalist monument is, for me, the monument on the Ground Zero in New York. Because it's combining everything, time, space, environment, and I haven't seen so much convincing examples of monuments which are not monumentalistic. And I would like to know, what is your opinion about this, in my view, great invention of making an anti-monumentalist monument? In my view, it's one of the best solutions of this problem.
Oh, yeah, like the Ground Zero. And then, because I've been working on this historical trauma and how this, I mean, when I say historical trauma, it is not just a commonsensical term. It's like really historical catastrophe, such as Hiroshima or the Holocaust or like 9/11. So if I use this term anti-monument as a way to commemorate something that is very hard to represent, but at the same time we want to remember. But still, I don't want to kind of make a flat kind of equation between every disaster, every tragedy with that scale of catastrophe. So yeah, 9/11, that is also very, very particular and specific example. And as you said, that the solution to the Ground Zero was the best solution at this point I think we can have. But if it was in Korea, we would build like a whole new building because the land is so expensive. So, so like, you know, ground zero, that can be a great, good example to show how we deal with this, you know, the tragedy. And then that is, I think that is very specific example that you cannot just easily kind of use in every other kind of situations. I'm not sure if I answer your question properly, but we can continue talk later because we are office neighbors.
So perhaps let's take one last question from over on this side and then.
Hi, thank you for your talks. I think our idea in contemporary art, the idea of an anti-monument is not to have a monument. Thinking about the other field, anti-aging, it's not stop aging, is what do we do about aging, how we slow down the process of degeneration. So,
Like
why it's
aging,
funny?
The idea of the opposite of aging is not.
Did I say something wrong?
It's like working with aging,
Well, so
slowing it down. So
I think in contemporary world is what do we do to negate that notion of monument? And if there's a way we can look at monument differently, if we gaze up, that's the normal way we look at a monument. Can we change that gaze? And who can we commemorate? And I think this is the directions we are looking into, is to negate monument.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. And I believe that is kind of like in a contemporary artist, not just in a contemporary artist, but you know, this, you know, politically very conscious and socially kind of motivated artists try to kind of deal with this, you know, a lot of political and social issues, not in monumental way. That is kind of like an ongoing process, I believe. And yeah, thank you.
So thank you all so much for your engagement. It's always good to end on a point of agreement. So now that we can all agree about this, I believe we can also agree with some words from Alexa about, but first of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you once again to our speakers.
Thank you all to the speakers and to our moderators, to the audience. It was a very full, rich day. And now we're all going to round it out with a reception at the Lux Hotel. And everybody who would like to join us, please come and join us. For those who don't know where it is when you're driving out of Church Lane. It's the first driveway off Sunset. And you can park there, and the scholars and presenters will be taken there by shuttle. So if anybody still needs further instructions, meet me out there and I'll give you a little bit more detailed information. Okay, thank you all.